Okay, let's finish up with this chapter, and we'll talk about the peopling of the New World. That is to say, North and South America. We've already talked about Australia. We've talked about the Pacific Islands. We've talked about humans emerging out of Africa and going to places all over Asia and Europe and Africa as well. But the last territory that we need to cover now is the North and South America. For a long time, the evidence was thin of how Americans, the earliest people, came to the Americas. When the European settlers came to the New World from Europe, there were people living here. So how did they get here, and when did they get here? It was based on early archaeology. It was, as we've looked at before, culture history. How far back do the artifacts go? And we didn't really have dating techniques until the 1950s, and so this is all based on relative dating and stratigraphy. We now are able to date some of these periods, and there was a push for a long time that the earliest artifacts that were found were what are so-called Clovis, and these are based on Clovis points. I have a photograph of a Clovis point in your slideshow. These are really interesting artifacts in their own right. They have what's called an overshot technique. Also, you get this with the Folsom blades from slightly later, and you risk breaking it right at the end of making it. So you've spent a lot of time making this nice spear point, and then the last thing you do is you hit it really hard, and if you get it wrong, you've destroyed what you've just spent a lot of time working on. But if you get it right, it's a really fine piece of well-crafted technology. But it's now becoming more clear that Clovis may not be the earliest things that existed here in North America. So the Clovis first model, while it dominated for many, many decades, we're now starting to discover things that are slightly earlier, but the evidence is very thin, and so there's a lot of discussion. This is actually a hot topic of research and interest amongst archaeologists, whether or how early is the first inhabitation. There's a pre-Clovis period, which predates about 13,500 years ago, which was earlier thought to be sort of the cutoff for you didn't get humans in North or South America. Earlier than that, it's now becoming clear that that is probably untrue, and that there is an earlier pre-Clovis inhabitation. We'll look at some of the models for that. And then there are some hypotheses of early arrivals that humans were present in the New World by about 30,000 years ago. But as we're going to look at, the evidence for that is really very sparse and also a little bit conflicted. There is, some people make claims, but the evidence is problematic, and so we'll look at some of that in a moment. So I want you to recall your lessons on how to do archaeology so you understand how to evaluate these claims of very early arrivals in the New World. So how did they get here? Well, the common way of thinking about this is that, as we recall from our earlier discussions, there were ice ages. Remember that? And the ice traps a lot of the seawater into big blocks of ice. So the sea levels are lower, which means that when there's not water, that if it's drained in the sea, then you have the coastline receding. You have more land. So places that were once land, and actually quite nice places for hunting and gathering, are now underwater. And one of these places we call an ancient landmass, which is now underwater. We call it the Bering Strait. It's the stretch of water between Alaska and Siberia, but it was a land mass, and actually quite a large one. And it's often referred to, you'll hear it as the Bering Land Bridge, but we really should refer to it as Beringia. It was a land mass. It was a place. It wasn't just a conduit from Siberia into North America. It was from Asia into North America. It was its own location, and there's increasing evidence that that was a pretty popular spot for people to live. It's now underwater. That's where you the deadliest catch goes and gets all of their crabs up there in the Bering Sea. It's all underwater, but they often dredge up artifacts in these trawling missions of ancient human inhabitation of what we call Beringia. So this was ice-free as well, which meant it would have been marshy, it would have had lots of vegetation for mammals. It was sort of a steppe desert, so it wasn't very tree-filled, but it would have been marshy and lots of vegetation for mammals, big game for people to hunt. So it would have been a popular spot for humans. But is that the way that people came to North America? Well, certainly people were living in Beringia at this time. But to get into North America, there were glaciers in Alaska, in Canada, and so it's long been known that there were breaks in the ice sheet that covered North America. Big swaths of the continent were covered in ice, though that would have been impassable, so that's not a route. But right in the middle of Canada, coming down into the middle of North America, there was what was called the ice-free corridor. And so humans could have migrated through the interior of the U.S., into the interior of North America, was now ending up in what is the United States. And that for a long time was what was considered the passage from Asia into North America, was through that ice-free corridor. But as we're going to see, there's some problematic dates and evidence which suggest that while that may have happened, that might not have been the only way that people got here. And there's increasing evidence that the coast may have been the way that people came. But that coastline is now very deeply submerged, so it's hard to get to, it's hard to find the evidence for that. And so the West Coast may hold the key to some of these migratory routes. The Clovis first model was developed in Clovis, New Mexico, were found below the later Folsom points that I mentioned. So this was relative dating, that you found these early Folsom points, which were thought to be really, really early, but then they found Clovis, which was earlier. Now we're sort of getting hints that Clovis may not have been the earliest inhabitation as well. So Clovis is found across a lot of North America, not really in the Great Basin here. We have a competing technology called the Western Stem tradition here in Nevada. And the Clovis technology, these big spear points for hunting big game, were also accompanied by other types of artifacts that represent their lifestyle. You had blades, you had bone tools, you had multifunctional tools. You also have hearths and possibly even a well. So these were sophisticated people that were coming to North America, learning their environment, adapting to it, and creating the tools that helped them to survive. Clovis-like points, so things that look sort of like the precursors to Clovis, are found in both Siberia and Alaska before 13,500 BC. Broken Mammoth Cave in Beringia has the Nanana culture, which is between about 14,000 to 12,800 years ago, and small bifaces and triangular points. But also in Ushkia in Siberia, you have a very similar assemblage. So you have in Siberia and you have in Alaska very similar types of technologies and traditions and crafting taking place. Right in the middle, which is now underwater, would have been Beringia. The pre-Clovis evidence is, as I said, very thin. Some have contested dates, like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania may have contaminated dates. This is where your confidence in the archaeological record has to be very solid for you to make a claim that something is 23,000 years old, because there's really no other evidence for that. Some people argue that there are other pieces of evidence, but all of this has problems with it, as we'll see. But there is one that seems to be pretty clear. Monteverde in Chile, the southernmost part of Chile, dating to about 15,000 years ago. We are not dating it directly, but there is a peat layer that it dates to between 14,000 and 12,500 years ago, and this is below that peat layer, so probably as early as 15,000 years ago. And it has a whole range of things, from stone tools, points, bones, rope, wood, huts, trade items, and even possibly a human footprint. How did they get all the way from Beringia, the very far north, to southern Chile, the very far south of the world? How did they get there, and how did they get there that quickly? Well, this is where that coastal route might come in. They might not have actually gone, in the earliest instances, through the interior, as you would expect, because if that were the case, your hypothesis would be the earliest things would be in the central United States, coming down through Mexico, and only then ending up in the south of South America. But it now appears as though some of the earliest dates we have for occupation of humans in the New World is in the furthest south bit. So maybe they were just following a coastal route all the way along from Beringia south, and then they ran out of space when they reached Chile. That's possible. Was Clovis just a regional tradition? Was this just like a local craft technology that didn't go beyond New Mexico? Well, it seems like we're getting some of these same types of tools all across the New World. You get Clovis in same kind of triangular bifaces in Pedra Pintada in Brazil, and also Quebrada Tacohue in Peru, all dating from about 13,000 to about 11,500 BC. But they were using this technology in different ways. So Clovis in Brazil, they were painting, hunting, fishing, and in Peru they had extensive consumption of marine foods and seabirds. Both of these sites are contemporary with Clovis. So how did people get to South America so early? We're sort of thinking that some of the transit sites were overlooked. And they may have been coastal dwellers, and only later penetrating the interior of the Americas, maybe through that ice-free corridor that I mentioned before. So there may be multiple waves of migration at different times by different groups of people. And so it's a complex process of possibly multiple migrations, multiple routes, multiple times, but Clovis may have been one tradition amongst many. Is there evidence for much earlier, the early model? Well, your book talks a little bit about some sites in Beringia from 30,000 years ago, Yana River site in eastern Siberia, which would have been part of the greater Beringia area, and Old Crow Basin in Canada, which is from about 40,000 years ago, but there's context issues in this Canadian site. Monteverde in Chile also has possibility of 33,000 years old dates, but that doesn't seem to be verifiable. So we only know that it's older than about 14,000 to 1,200. So 15,000 is a fairly reasonable date, but to suggest that it's as old as 33,000 has flimsy evidence. And there's also a smattering of other claims that some archaeologists make. Even in California, there was one recently where there was a broken bone that they said was done by human tools, but it's also been demonstrated that that can be done by a bulldozer, which happened to be excavating the site that they were investigating. So was it a bulldozer or was it humans? Probably a bulldozer that did the damage. So are these natural or man-made, human-made artifacts sometimes? Are fires that you find, are those natural fires, are those human-made fires? It's sometimes hard to tell. Also, there is a hypothesis called the Solutrean hypothesis. Very few people put very much stock in this. There are superficial similarities between the Solutrean points that we saw in Europe in an earlier chapter with the Clovis points that we see here in North America. The problem with this is that there is a lack of a flute, this overshot technique that I was talking about on the Solutrean points. So they're not made exactly the same way. There's a superficial similarity. But Solutrean points in Europe end 5,000 years before Clovis. Now that we've been talking in terms of hundreds of thousands and millions of years for a couple of chapters, but we're now getting much more precise in our ability to date. So 5,000 years is a big enough gap where you can pretty reasonably discount the Solutrean hypothesis that humans from Europe came across by a northern route into eastern North America and settled that way. That doesn't appear to be very likely, and certainly not explanatory of what the evidence we're seeing mostly on the west coast and coming through Beringia. Also, there are few skeletons that are older than 9,000 years old, although there is one Naya from which your book doesn't mention because it's fairly new, from Hoyo Negro in Mexico, in Yucatan, that is as old as 12 to 13,000 years ago. Old, and it's probably the oldest skeleton that's ever been found. One that and it shows links to Beringia. So this is sort of a contemporary with Clovis, and probably one of the earliest inhabitants to come across from Beringia. There are genetic similarities with those Beringian populations as well. So some interesting information coming out of that. One very controversial skeletal remains that were found in the Columbia River Basin in, I think, Washington State, maybe Oregon, was Kennewick Man. This was the Kennewick area, and it was controversial because they found a fairly complete skeleton. There were some issues with the Native Americans wanting to rebury it as part of the laws of NAGPRA here in America, the North American Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, that they said, this is our ancestor, this is on our land, we want it reburied. Scientists wanted to study it, there was a lawsuit, and there was discussion about, is it actually the ancestor of the local Native American group? To some extent, that's not really the question, right? It is, if they have jurisdiction over a particular land, they ought to have the right to rebury remains. As a scientist, I like to be able to study them, but I'm also sensitive to indigenous claims of ownership. And one interesting aspect was the skull had a bit of a sloping forehead, and it had some features that when reconstructed looked, I'll use this in air quotes, Caucasoid. It looked like a European. In fact, the reconstruction, they chose not to have any presumptions, so it was just clay colored, it was gray, the reconstructed face from the skull. And they also didn't make any assumptions about hair, so there was no hair on it, and it looked for all the world like Sir Patrick Stewart. And so there were claims that this was a European, and this is actually false. So it was just a superficial similarity to Patrick Stewart that some websites got a hold of, like Stormfront, and it became sort of used by people that were trying to claim white supremacy over North America and disenfranchise Native Americans from their ancestral ownership. So that's where I've mentioned this before. You need to be careful with archaeology because whoever owns the past owns the present, and it can be used for good or it can be used for nefarious purposes. So, just a few more things. Clovis What were they doing in the Clovis period? Well, it appears as though they were specializing in large game hunting. Mammoth, horse, camel, these sorts of things all existed in North America at that time. And they had, there's some evidence for storage of meat as well. There's some spear points found in context with megafauna, as we call them. These are animals larger than usually 50 pounds. Blackwater Draw and Colby, Wyoming both have evidence for hunting context with these spear points. And why don't we have these animals anymore? Well, there was a long thought that humans, when they came here, they just made animals go extinct. That doesn't seem to really be the case, and we don't think that very much anymore, because there's too few kills to be an extinction level event in North America. Also, some sites focus on, we have evidence for smaller game being hunted, and probably lots of vegetation being gathered as well. So why did mastodons, mammoth, horses, camels, why did they all go extinct in North America? Well, you have to remember there were ice ages, and these were ending at this time. So this was the end of the ice age, and these megafauna were thriving under certain environmental conditions. When those conditions changed, it's likely that they had extra stress on them, and that's more likely to be the cause of their extinction. Overhunting is probably unlikely to be the principal cause for their extinction. There's another hypothesis that there was an extraterrestrial impact, that is to say, some sort of a meteor or a event. And this correlates with one of the last. It seems like there's no crater, but it could have been an air blast of a meteor. And there's some iridium in some locations that show that could have actually occurred. Also, there's this layer, this stratum that dates to this time period that is called the black mat, and it has been argued that this was big conflagrations, big fires set off by these bombardment of meteorites coming to as an extraterrestrial impact. But this also has a lot of contrasting opinions about that. For instance, the Earth is constantly having micrometeorites hitting it, sometimes large, and that doesn't create global catastrophes and global extinctions in very many cases. Also, megafauna extinction seems to have been gradual at the end of the Pleistocene, at the end of the Ice Age here. Not a catastrophic event. It seems like they were trailing off and dying off. And humans didn't die off in a catastrophe either. Why would humans survive but all these megafauna not? So if we were getting pummeled by meteorites, why aren't we gone too? And finally, this evidence for a black mat being these big fires wasn't actually fires at all. The black mat, this black layer, is not from burning. It's